Before you die, there is something you should know about us, Lone Star.
What?
I am your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate.
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing.
This is the Fed in its own words talking about the end of its balance sheet. Hey guys, Rafi here from the End Game Investor, and today I want to talk about how the Fed goes bankrupt, what happens when it goes bankrupt, and why it is a myth to say that the dollar is backed by nothing. But if the Fed goes bankrupt, the dollar will in fact be backed by literally nothing, and its value will fall to zero. First of all, the dollar is not backed by nothing. It was originally backed by almost all gold or silver. And then when the Fed took over the banking system, the dollar is now a unit of liability of the Federal Reserve, and therefore it is backed by the assets on its balance sheet. However, now with interest rates rising, there will come a point very soon, and I have a date on this by the Fed itself, when the Fed will pay more dollars in interest than it earns from the assets on its balance sheet. And therefore, what will you have? It's actually simpler than it sounds. Because of all the money printing that took place in the COVID era and before, you have the banks being paid 2.5% now on all the extra reserves that the Fed does not want slamming into the economy, to be kept at the Fed and out of the banking system for obvious reasons, because you can't have the money supply exploding by $2.5 trillion and a multiplier effect overnight. That would be hyperinflationary. And so the Fed has to pay interest on those reserves to keep them out of the economy to the banks. And now the interest that it earns on its assets is fixed because it's not buying any more assets. It's not expanding its balance sheet anymore. But the interest that it pays the banks to keep the existing money out of the economy goes higher and higher and higher. And so the Fed has to pay more and more while its assets shrink. And so the new dollars that it has to print to these banks become literally backed by absolutely nothing, by no assets at all.
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
And at that point, you do actually have a point where the new dollars are backed by nothing and their purchasing power must drastically fall. And now we have actual numbers on this and how bad they are going to get. And I'm going to read to you straight from the New York Fed itself. This is not me making it up. This is not some Austrian economist extremist talking about the end of the world. This is the Fed in its own words talking about the end of its balance sheet. This is from a May 2022 publication from the New York Fed called Open Market Operations during 2021. How wonderful. Here's the key paragraph. Similar to the sensitivity of net income, when interest rates are 100 basis points higher than indicated in the March desk surveys, the unrealized loss on the portfolio reaches nearly $800 billion, which is roughly 11% of the entire portfolio, meaning the entire Federal Reserve balance sheet. Now, if interest rates were to rise 200 basis points higher than indicated in the March desk surveys, and I'll get into what the March desk surveys are, the unrealized loss would be much higher than 11%. Meaning 200 basis points higher than the March desk surveys. Let's go into what the March desk surveys are. This is questions that they ask banks about interest rates back in March. Here are the answers that they get. Year-end 2022, back in March, they assumed that interest rates would be 1.38%. They're already now 2.5. End of year 2024, 2.38%. They're already 2.5%. Longer run, 2.5%. So if they're already 2.5% and you've already had another indication of a 75 basis point hike coming in September, they're going to go up to 3.25%. That is already about 200 basis points higher than the year-end 2022 already. And so what did the Fed say back here? If interest rates were to rise 200 basis points higher than indicated in the March desk surveys, which they already will be by September, the unrealized loss on the balance sheet will be much higher. So you'd have 800 billion times 2, $1.6 trillion loss in the balance sheet. So you'd have all these dollars pouring into the economy with less and less assets to back them, meaning functionally the dollars that are pouring into the economy to keep the money at the banks and the reverse repos will be backed by deferred assets, which means absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all.
Then you will have a situation that is ripe for hyperinflation from a lack of any backing for the new dollars that come into the economy. Alternatively, what can the Fed do? They can stop paying interest to the banks to keep those extra reserves in the reverse repos out of the economy. Then what happens? All those reverse repos come pouring into the economy because there's no reason to keep them at the Fed anymore. So either way, whether they pay interest or they don't pay interest, you have hyperinflation. And so with interest rates already 200 basis points higher than the March desk surveys, we're looking at a $1.6 trillion loss for the Fed in 2023. But interest rates are going to keep heading higher and higher and higher, much higher than 200 basis points higher than the March desk surveys. It's going to be 7, 8%. What happens if interest rates go to 9%, 10%? If they go anywhere near where Volcker put them in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the balance sheet will be composed of deferred assets. And what the hell is a deferred asset? It's an asset that doesn't exist. Just like every homeless bum has trillions of dollars in deferred assets that he would like to have, but he doesn't actually have. And so if a bum pays you with deferred assets, you're not really going to give him much in return. And therefore, if the Fed is filled with deferred assets on its balance sheet, it has absolutely nothing. And therefore, its liability unit, the dollar, becomes worthless. Just like the unit of liability from a bum on the street who gives you a piece of paper and says it's a deferred asset, you're not going to be able to buy anything with that. And so you won't accept it. And therefore, that is why, from a balance sheet perspective, the dollar is going to hyperinflate probably in 2023 when the Fed experiences trillions of dollars in losses as interest rates go higher and higher. Alternatively, it will reverse course on interest rates and push them back down again in another final round of QE, which will bring gold to infinity in either case. Not infinity in purchasing power, infinity in dollar terms, which means that the dollar will be dead and the money remaining will be the gold and silver that used to directly back it. And we return to the base of the pyramid, and from there we have the real bona fide reset. What it looks like exactly after that, I don't know, but we'll all find out soon enough. This is Rafi of the Endgame Investor. If you enjoyed this missive about the end of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, then subscribe for a 2-week free trial of the Endgame Investor, where I navigate my subscribers to get through this period of the endgame, which is coming soon. We see it in the numbers, we see it functionally, it is coming. Or you can become my patron on Patreon, where you'll get a weekly video on monetary policy topics from a biblical perspective, if you're into the religious stuff. This is Rafi, the Endgame Investor, wishing the Fed's balance sheet a beautiful death.